You know, Wes, I have no concerns about you, but I am a little worried someone's going to check my credentials and discover I am not nearly cool enough to be in this space. So I'm hoping to get at least a little, you know, kind of ancillary. So, you know, you're based in New York City, but you have examined these issues in cities around the country. And one thing, as we see just with the Amazon announcement this week, cities are thriving again. Many big cities are adding jobs. They're adding population after years of decline. They're once again establishing themselves as centers of innovation and dynamism in the economy. But the question that Margaret alluded to what extent is all of that growth benefiting people in the kind of neighborhoods you work in around the country?
Yeah, and first, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a real joy. Thank you all for having me. It's good being in Houston, even though I thought it'd be a little warmer, but that's all right. But I'm really excited that you guys are leading on this conversation because, you know, the truth is that there are a lot of exciting things happening. We're watching growth within cities. We're watching, you know, employment mechanisms within cities, which have been really exciting, but it's also really powerful to have this conversation in a place like Houston. Where, you know, you've watched all the things that Margaret alluded to in Houston, which are all real. But we also know that the poverty rate in Houston has actually gone up during that time. You know, Houston's actually similar to New York in some ways as well, where when you understand this fluidity of poverty and the complications of the fluidity of poverty, about how Houston, because it is such a welcoming city, because it is such a place that invites people, you know, and particularly even people who might be falling on harder times. You know, you look at the fact that Houston was one of the leading recipients of people who, after Hurricane Katrina, were looking and coming to Houston, right? Similar to New York after what happened in Puerto Rico, with the exception of Miami. New York received more people who were fleeing Puerto Rico after the hurricane than any other place after Hurricane Maria. But we also understand that at this time of booming growth, the fact that we have so many people who still repeatedly find themselves underwater. And when we're talking about the poverty rates, you know, within our cities, we're talking about the national poverty rate of $24,500 for a family of 4, right? And so even when we're talking about not just the growing poverty rate that we have within Houston, even the people who are right on the cusp, the millions more who are one shock away, the millions more who an unexpected bill, a hike in transportation costs, a child getting sick, little things like that that can immediately force a family back down. So the fact that we're having this conversation about growth is good, but what does it mean to make sure that this is inclusive growth, sustainable growth, inclusive growth? That has to matter and has to be at the forefront of the conversation.
Well, let me ask you about that because, you know, John Hickenlooper, when he was, now the governor of Colorado, when he was the mayor of Denver, he used to talk about what he called the Denver paradox, and it fits very much in with what Margaret was saying about Houston. He used to say, Denver, the economy is so good, the quality of life is so good, we are attracting talented people from all over the country and all over the world. And indeed, we see Houston is in exactly the same position. But the paradox was they could not put their own kids from low-income and minority neighborhoods on track to compete for the jobs they are creating. What does it take? I mean, it's pretty clear that does not happen by itself. The growth alone in a city does not create the bridge from neighborhoods that are left behind and those. What does it take? What have you seen that allows for more of that? Is there any place that's figured it out?
You know, so it's interesting. So there are places that have figured out, but it does take that level of deliberate thought and also the level of making some bets on some things that you know that you can have partnerships in a way to examine how this is actually going to work. So, for example, you know, I take a look at a city like Baltimore, where if you look at 15 years ago, the largest employer in Baltimore City was Bethlehem Steel. And basically, if you had a high school degree and a strong back, you had a job. Now the largest employer in Baltimore City is Johns Hopkins University. Try getting a job at Johns Hopkins with a high school degree and a strong back, right? And so the requirements of what is necessary and what is useful and what is purposeful have also continued to evolve. One thing that's happened where you find different areas that are looking for how do we adapt our educational system to be able to prepare for jobs for the future. You know, it's interesting, you mentioned Amazon earlier. And oftentimes people talk about, well, what were the incentives that these different jurisdictions offered to Amazon, and all those are really important questions. But the other really important question also has to be this: what were the things that Amazon needed to see in order for a city to be selected? Right? What were the things that needed to be in place for and again, if in 2018 it's Amazon, in 2019 it'll be somebody else, in 2020 it'll be somebody else. But when we're talking about things like a mass transit system that actually works to move people from homes to jobs and actually works not to separate communities, but a mass transit system that actually works to bring cities together. An education system that is actually preparing students for further employment opportunities and for further opportunities within that can actually make sure that these opportunities can stay within the localized jurisdictions. A high school system that's preparing students for either college or careers. So you're looking at all these things about how you find certain cities that have actually shown interesting models in order to, and are being rewarded for them, because you're watching economies that are growing, you're watching businesses that are moving in, and you also see the other side of the coin.
So let's talk about that other side, because this is your work at Robin Hood. And as we have gone around the country on this project in the last few years, we have seen lots of examples of innovation at the grassroots level, sometimes from local governments that are expanding pre-K, for example, sometimes nonprofits, sometimes alliances with local business, often working in combination. As you assess this problem, as you approach this problem, what are, in your minds, the delineated roles for national government, local government, nonprofits, the business community? What are the pieces that each have to contribute to making a dent?
So I think that's actually one of the things that I've been most excited about, is seeing how these different groups now are working together to be able to get this stuff done, where we all have a distinct and significant role to play. So, for example, I think about the work of Robin Hood. Robin Hood is one of the largest individual poverty-fighting organizations in America. Every year, Robin Hood will, give out well over $100 million into the poverty fight. And the truth is that I could walk to our team or walk into the office and say, you know what, guys, big idea this year. Let's put $25 million into education. And people would say, that's amazing. That's a huge, or 50 million, 75 million. Throw the number out. And they're like, that's extraordinary. And the truth is that if you look at the budget for the Department of Education in New York City alone, the budget for the Department of Education in New York City is $25 billion. So I could make a huge announcement saying 50 million, 75 million in education, and we still know that it would be a fraction of what DOE is going to put in. The reason I say that, though, is this. And so the question then becomes, how then do we compound our capital usefully? How do we take bets and make punts and be able to essentially de-risk the investments that we know can work, and then be able to present them to the larger partners who then can say, we can take this over, because essentially it's now de-risked. So, for example, you look at the issue of legal representation for people who are undocumented. In the United States, everyone has the legal right to legal representation unless you're undocumented. And so oftentimes what we would have then is 2-year-olds in immigration court defending themselves. So Robin Hood basically came in and said, you know what, we think there's a way we can actually do this. So we created this thing called the Immigrant Justice Corps. The Immigrant Justice Corps is essentially providing legal representation and providing lawyers to people, children, et cetera, families who are undocumented, to allow them legal representation as they go through the process of defending themselves. The city of New York saw that, saw the success around it, and is now basically taking it on because they said we can de-risk this.
With that example, so do you see the role of the nonprofits to fill niches that public policy doesn't fill, or to take risks that governments can't take initially themselves? Concepts.
Yeah, so I mean, my opinion on that is that philanthropies oftentimes don't have the size to be the safety net. But we can be the springboard. We can be the ones that can go and make the bets, make the punts. Think about the different policies that are in place that actually can be challenged, and the policies in place that actually can be changed. You know, you take another example, you look at housing court. If a person is living in subpar housing and a person then is then taken to housing court or tries to take their landlord to housing court, 90% of tenants who have to go to housing court will not have legal representation. 90% of landlords will. So landlords are basically using legal representation and using lawyers to defend their case, while their tenants do not have that. And so we actually funded and invested in this platform called Just Fixed. Just Fixed is a technology. It's a basic algorithmic technology that allows tenants to basically gather information, bind together, and then be able to make their legal arguments against their landlords with a greater sense of strength and a greater sense of cohesion. This platform a simple platform called Just Fixed, now is something that has continued to grow and scale and to go into multiple different cities. But so we found that our way of leveraging and our way of using our resources was use the resources to create not just a platform that works, but to expose a system that doesn't. And then be able to use those two things that are married to then be able to create a larger systemic change that was necessary in order for real.
As you noted, though, on many issues, ultimately you need public investment to get the scale to really have a dent. And public investment at both the national and the state level in young people is kind of moving in the opposite direction. As a share of GDP, federal spending on kids has been going down. Most states have only recently reached the level of K-12 spending per capita they had before the recession. And one that really jumps out to me is that in 2017, for the first time ever, public universities and colleges around the country got more of their revenue from tuition, which is basically parents and kids, than they did from state dollars. Now, all of this is happening as we are living through some pretty profound demographic milestones. Sometime before 2020, right around 2020, a majority of our under 18 population will be non-white for the first time in American history. Certainly here in Texas, 2/3 of the under 30 population are already young people of color. Are these two things coincidental or related? More diversity and less investment?
Well, and that's the thing. If you look at so many of these areas, Ron, these are areas that have been chronically underinvested in. You know, so this isn't, we're not even watching a new phenomenon. We're actually watching a continuation of policies that have been, you know, structurally broken in the ways that we are dealing with the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged and the most chronically put behind. You know, and part of it is, and I have a colleague at Robin who says, you know, oftentimes these conversation is a conversation of us versus them. Us versus them, us versus them. And the truth is, there's just an us.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, you know, one of the central realities, demographic realities of 21st century America is that an increasingly non-white workforce will be funding the retirement of a vastly expanding, mostly white pool of seniors. And we're adding 40 million more seniors. 80% of our seniors are white. And all of the future growth in the workforce projected over the next 20 years is non-white. But it has been very hard to politically convince that older generation that they have a stake in helping more of that younger, diverse generation get into the middle class. Are there any secrets to making that happen?
Yeah, so I think one of the big secrets is that we also have to do a better job of changing the narrative as to why people should care. Why does this matter to people? Because oftentimes when people are you know, will make an argument that it's like, well, it's either you're going to pay for this or you'll pay for a criminal justice system. You'll pay for this or you're going to pay for a, you know, social safety net, social welfare system. Fair. And the numbers actually show that actually is true. But it's also making the argument from a deficit perspective. We have to make the argument from an asset perspective. What are you missing out on if we're not having proper investments in the newest people to this country, to the children who are coming up in families that maybe they don't have the same level of lineage, but have an extraordinary amount of promise. So part of the narrative has to be, how are we thinking about this, not necessarily from saying we are doing this because we feel sorry for, but we're doing this because we should care. This is not a measure of sympathy.
It's mutual interest.
It's a complete mutual. If you're saying, if you're not doing this to be, you know, selfless, do it to be selfish. Because if you really want to be in a community that is safe and prosperous and thriving, make sure everybody in that community feels like it is safe and prosperous and thriving.
And your Medicare and Social Security is funded along the way.
That's
so let me ask you
right.
this. Your personal story is very relevant to this discussion, and you have turned it into literature of a very high order with your book, The Other Wes Moore, about your life and the life of another young African-American man in the same neighborhood that you grew up with. Tell us a little bit about that story and what you have learned and taken away from your relationship with the other Wes Moore.
So it's just basically right after I had just received the Rhodes Scholarship, the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper, wrote this article about how I was a local kid who just received this scholarship, and I was going overseas to go study with these 31 other American students. And at the same time, we're talking about my life and my childhood, and how I had quite a few issues coming up. I grew up in a single-parent household. I first got involved in the justice system, or got involved with the justice system, when I was 11 years old. I was asked to leave my first school by the time I was 10. And it talked about the series of interventions, second chances, et cetera, that kind of led to me now receiving this scholarship. And at the same time, they're writing a whole series of articles about 4 guys who one day walked into a jewelry store. And in the process of robbing this jewelry store in this botched robbery, they ended up killing an off-duty police officer. And this off-duty police officer was a 13-year veteran of the Baltimore police force. He was a 3-time recipient of Police Officer of the Year. He was also a father of 5 who just had triplets. And he was working this second job as a security guard to make extra money for his family. And after a 12-day national manhunt, all 4 guys were caught. And one of the people that the police caught was also named Wes Moore. And I found out that we were from the same area. We both grew up in single-parent households, both were involved in the justice system, et cetera. And as I was getting ready to head off to England on this scholarship, he was getting ready to spend the rest of his life in Jessup Correctional Institution, and where he is still to this day. He's now in year 17 of his life sentence. And the thing that I really wanted to explore was how thin that line is between our life and someone else's life. The thing that I really wanted to explore was how quickly as a society we can either congratulate or castigate without being willing to delve into the understanding and asking the question of why. And how quick we are to have this conversation about the others. And hence the name of the book, The Other Wes Moore, without being able to delve into what it means for those who are consistently growing up as the others. And that as we're thinking about this larger growth and this larger hope and this larger promise of this country, that the larger hope and the larger promise of this country is that this country has a place for everybody. And that this country relies on all of our collective successes. And so this idea of coming up with growth, this idea of believing in inclusion, this idea of understanding that everybody, that while not everybody starts from the same place, that we all at least have the opportunity to move, that has to be something that's real. And really what I wanted to do with these stories and what I wanted to do with this book was to be able to take the reader on a journey where the reader knows the conclusion by simply looking at the back flap of the book. But let's go on this journey of these 2 kids and then end up understanding, A, what causes these splits, but then also understanding the things that we collectively can and should be thinking about and doing when it comes to making sure that opportunities are real.
Let's see if we can get one question from the audience here. Do we have a question? Do we have microphones? No? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, we do. Yes, we have one.
My name is Hadia Malawi. I'm the Community Initiatives Manager at Houston Grand Opera. And thank you, Wes, for your really impactful story.
Thank you.
I just wanted to know to what extent you think that even though you came from a single mother household and so did the other Wes, you feel that maybe the nature of the upbringing, the quality of attention, the nurturing that you got from your mother may have been that thin line between your paths?
Great question. Bless you, Heidi. Thank you so much. And you know, I say and I believe deeply that, you know, the greatest gift that God gave me was one that I didn't ask for. And that was the day that he asked Joy Moore to give birth to me. Right? I mean, he blessed me without me even realizing how important a blessing that was. But I also know that when I think about myself and Wes, this was not the story of a good mom versus a bad mom. It was not the story of one kid gets sent away and the other kid did not. I think what ended up fundamentally happening was we have to redefine family in our society. That family is not just the person who is of blood or of kin. Family is the person who you will do anything to protect and align and create opportunities for. You know, because I think about it in my own life. You know, the truth is that there are people who are of no blood relation to me whatsoever who I would ride for. There's nothing I wouldn't do for them. And there are people, frankly, who are blood family, who I might walk by on the street. Right? I think that I was blessed by the mom I had. And she'll be the first one to say, if she was sitting right here, it was not a perfect experience by any stretch of the imagination. You know, she was a very young widow who, and she'll be the first one to tell you, made a lot of mistakes and was going through a lot. But at the same time, I think people found the collective vision and the collective involvement to make sure that they were supporting her, supporting me, supporting my sisters, and changing the definition of family. Because I think that's actually how we then have to get to that point. And understanding when you were talking about single moms, you know, they're not our nation's burden. They've been our nation's backbone for a very long time.
Wes, before we go, if people want to learn more about what Robinhood does and what you do, where would they find it?
Yeah, so for Robinhood and for myself, you go to Robinhood, Robinhood.org is our site, and then also on social media, it's just, you know, I am Wes Moore on all the different social media platforms, just, you know, at I am Wes Moore or at Robinhood NYC. And the truth is that, you know, we're New York based, but the truth is we're working on an issue and fighting for an issue that is not a New York issue alone. We believe deeply in the idea of partnership. We believe deeply in the idea of best practices. And we believe deeply on getting this right.
Well, you have given us a great framework for the day. Join me in thanking Wes Moore.
Thank you, guys.